Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum, dear viewers. So this is our second episode on the issue of capital punishment, and we have seen in the previous episode that Ustaz Ahmadi says that the death punishment or the capital punishment can only be given in the case that someone murders someone or is guilty of fasad fil ard or muharaba. And we have seen how the objections raised against this view of Ustaz in the case of an example like apostasy was discussed and explained in our previous episode. So today we'll be discussing two further instances. So one of them, of course, is blasphemy, and the other is the issue of rajm or stoning to death. And we know that in the times of the Prophet, this stoning to death occurred for issues which, according to our scholars, was other than fasad fil ard and murder itself. So first, let us take up the issue of blasphemy. Today we'll look at our criticism which says that blasphemy is also punishable by death, and hence, or the viewpoint in fact of Ustaz Ghamidi, which says that blasphemy is warranted only in the case of capital punishment and spreading disorder in the land is not correct. So they say that because those perpetrators who had been guilty of blasphemy were also punished by death, this shows that they were another crime for which this punishment was given. So according to Ustaz Ghamidi, if we look first of all in the Quran, then there is absolutely no punishment which is prescribed for blasphemy. There is not a single verse that can be cited in favor of the punishment of blasphemy. In fact, he says that there are several verses, and he then cites one particular passage from the Quran which shows that these Jews would come in the presence of the Prophet, and they would be guilty of some misdemeanor, and at the same time they would not be conducting themselves in a befitting way, and they would be insulting the Prophet. But then still there was no reaction showed by the Quran or anything from God which would authorize the Prophet from taking any offensive measure. So Ustaz Ghamidi cites verse 46 of Surah Nisa and says that we can see from these words that they were insulting to the Prophet, and of course in spite of that there was no response elicited from him, and neither did the Quran tell him to give any response, let alone punish them in such a way. So the words are مِنَ الَّذِينَ هَادُوا يُحَرِّفُونَ الْكَلِمَ عَن مَّوَاضِعِهِ وَيَقُولُونَ سَمِعْنَا وَعَصَيْنَا وَاسْمَعْ غَيْرَ مُسْمَعٍ وَرَاعِنَا لَيًّا بِأَلْسِنَتِهِمْ وَطَعْنًا فِي الدِّينِ وَلَوْ أَنَّهُمْ قَالُوا سَمِعْنَا وَأَطَعْنَا وَاسْمَعْ وَانظُرْنَا لَكَانَ خَيْرًا لَهُمْ وَأَقْوَمًا. Those who have become Jews, one of their groups, twisting their tongues and mocking religion, strips the words of their context and says Sami'na wa asayna and Isma' ghayra musma'in and Ra'ina. However, if they had said Sami'na wa ata'na and Isma' and Unzurna, it would have been better for them and also more proper as regards the occasion and situation. So as far as this is concerned, it is basically a succinct reference to the mockery which the mischief mongers among the Jews would indulge in to show disrespect to the Prophet and to belittle and disparage him before others, also the religion brought by him. So one example of this was their distortion of the words spoken in the gatherings of the Arabs to praise and to acknowledge the speaker and to express the enthusiasm and fervor of the listeners. So these words are primarily meant to express, as I said, praise and acknowledgement. But if someone wants to mock or be insolent, he can very easily change praise to disrespect and acknowledgement to sarcasm and ridicule by slightly twisting his tongue or by distorting the pronunciation or by simply creating an artificial style in the tone. It may or may not harm the speaker, but it does make the mischief monger happy because he is able to vent his emotions. So if we look at these words more closely, so the words are Sami'na wa ata'na, which literally mean we listened and we obeyed. Now the Arabs would utter these words when they wanted to express their readiness and inclination to comply with the directive of an elder, a big chief, or a king. So the word ta'a used in Arabic conveys this meaning as well, which means obedience. But when these mischief mongers among the Jews would go to the gatherings of the Prophet, they would say the words Samina wa ata'ana every now and then, which of course literally mean we listened and we obeyed, to show their own obedience and docility. But they would slightly change the pronunciation of these words. They would actually utter ata'ana as asaina. I mean, you can easily twist your tongue and say it in a quick way to make the person to whom you're speaking or people who are listening to see or to hear the word asaina instead of ata'ana. So you can say asaina. And the word asaina means we disobeyed. So it would mean samena wa asaina, we listened and we disobeyed. Now the reason is that the letters of both these words have a similar pronunciation and tone. They would be successful in this distortion. And in this manner, they would convert a sentence expressing compliance and obedience to one expressing rebellion and disobedience. And those who understood this play on words would not be able to check them. They would easily put forth the excuse they had actually uttered the words Samina wa Atana, whereas, of course, they had said Samina wa Asaina. So, in this situation, a decent and honorable person would consider quietly ignoring these comments to be the best option. Similarly, the literal meaning of the words Isma' ghayra musma'in. Musma'in would mean listen to what has not been said as yet. Now, the positive sense of this expression is that when a listener, on hearing words of wisdom from a speaker, directs the attention of a fellow listener to the wise words of the speaker, for they are hearing them for the first time, and never before have they come across these words. Obviously, this is not only an expression of duly valuing and honoring the speaker, it is also an exhortation to others to do so. But these words can also be used in the negative sense to hoot and make fun of the speaker. In this case, the meaning would be listen to his unheard talk. What baseless things is he saying? Who must have heard such a thing? I mean, it's an unheard thing. So obviously, a mere change in style and tone transforms this positive expression of praise into one inflicted with the poison of mockery and contempt. And this changed tone cannot be checked, because if it is, the speaker can easily present the excuse that he has not said these words scornfully, but he has uttered them to praise the speaker. Now, since the element of ridicule in this expression was created by the words ghayra musma', the Quran broke its sting by directing people to say only isma', listen, not ghayra musma'in, but isma'. Similarly, the word ra'ina actually literally means please give us allowance and concession. The positive sense of this word is that if the listener has not properly heard or understood what has been said by a speaker, or if what is said has so much wisdom and subtlety in it that the listener wants to hear it again from the speaker, then he requests him to speak the words again or to repeat them. So, in other words, Raina means please say it again. It reflects the enthusiasm and inclination of the listener towards knowledge. But if the mischief mongers or the mischief makers among the Jews, if they would just twist their tongue and they would twist and distort the pronunciation, which is layul lisan, as this verse also says, they would change this word to a word of ridicule. They would stress on the intonation of the letter ain in ra'ina, and they would make it sound like ra'ina. Now, the words ra'ina would mean our shepherd. Ra'ina would mean give us concession, please repeat it. But ra'ina, by just stressing the ain, would mean, oh, our shepherd. Now, owing to this distortion by the Jews, the Quran has excluded this word from the etiquette of a Muslim gathering, and in its place asked them to use the word unzurna, which means please grant us some respite and please give us attention again. So, as per its meaning, this word is an exact substitute of ra'ina, and even if its pronunciation is distorted, its meaning cannot. So, you can clearly see that in this one instance, when the Prophet was insulted in this way, there was no retaliation. Not only was there no retaliation, a different means of strategy, a different strategy was given to the Prophet, and of course they were ignored. So there are other instances also that can be cited which show that in the wake of this insolence, this impetuous behavior, this insulting behavior, the Prophet was not allowed to take any offensive step. The second thing which Ustaz Ghamidi has cited is that there is a narrative. I mean, there is one narrative which is often quoted. Many other narratives which relate to this blasphemy incident are either weak or they are totally unfounded. But one narrative which is seemingly, it is cited a lot, is something which he says that has been unanimously rejected by the muhaddisun, which says, man sabba nabiyyan faqtuluhu, which means that whoever abuses a prophet, whoever abuses a messenger, you should put him to death. This narrative, this hadith, has been unanimously declared as inauthentic by all the hadith scholars. So although it is cited by many scholars, contemporary scholars, it has absolutely no authenticity. The third thing which Ustaz Ghamidi has pointed out relate to certain incidents that have been cited in narratives. Now, narratives related to punishment for blasphemy that are often cited, Ustaz Ghamidi says that they should be understood correctly. Abu Rafi was one of those people who was guilty of bringing out the tribes against Medina in the Battle of the Ditch, the Ghazwa of Khandaq. In the words of Ibn Ishaq, he was as a Fiman Hazzab al-Ahzaba ala Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, that he was the one who brought these tribes against the Prophet. About Ka'b ibn Ashraf, the historians write that after the Battle of Badr, he went to Mecca and recited vengeance-inspiring elegies for those of the Quraysh who had fallen in the battle. He wrote odes that prefaced the names of some Muslim women and caused much distress to Muslims, and while residing in the domain of the Prophet's government, endeavored to incite people against him. So the case of Ka'b ibn Ashraf and Abu Rafi cannot be made any example, because it was not blasphemy per se, it was some other offenses that they were guilty of, because of which they were executed or they were put to death. Similarly, a third incident related to Abdullah ibn Khatal. He was also killed or he was executed. Now, the true story behind it is that he was sent for the collection of zakat by the Prophet, and he was accompanied by a person from among the Ansar, from the Ansar tribe. A person from the Ansar tribe accompanied him, and a servant also. So on the way, Ibn Khatal killed the servant on the pretext of insubordination and became an apostate. He just gave up religion and he ran away to Mecca. Not only this, all three people which have just been mentioned here, they persisted in their denial of Prophet Muhammad, even after the truth of his message had become conclusively evident to them. So God Almighty has mentioned repeatedly in the Quran as a divine principle that the direct addressees of a Rasul are within the range of divine punishment. For that reason, if they go on to the extent of hostility, they can also be killed. So it thus becomes evident that these three cases were not cases in any way of blasphemy. They were killed in response to certain other offenses. So Abdullah ibn Khatal was a murderous fugitive. It was decreed on these grounds that he be killed even if he was hiding behind the covers of the Kaaba. It was indeed offenders of this kind to whom Surah Ahzab refers. In order to sow the seeds of doubt in Muslims, to turn them away from the Prophet and to damage their reputation and the moral credibility of their religion badly, these wrongdoers would engage in many activities as cooking up stories about the personal lives of Muslims, slandering them, and carrying out scandal mongering, sometimes expressing desire to marry Prophet's holy wives, and spreading rumors to all kinds to unnerve and demoralize Muslims. They would sometimes tease Muslim ladies who went out to the fields at night or before daylight to pay heed to the call of nature. When reprimanded for this behavior, these evildoers would come up with the lame excuse as having approached a woman only because they mistook her for a slave girl of such and such a person, and because they needed to ask her about such and such a matter. The Quran alludes to these aspects of their mischief and narratives in Muslim tradition according to many of these related incidents in quite some detail. Muslim ladies therefore were told to put their cloaks over themselves to appear different from slave girls so that the mischievous miscreants would not have pretext to tease them. Also, the troublemakers were warned that if they would not stop and desist in this matter, they would be executed in an exemplary way. And the Quran has made it very explicitly clear when it says, and I quote from the Quran, this is Surah 33, Surah Azab, verses 60 and 61. لَإِن لَمْ يَنْتَهِ الْمُنَافِقُونَ وَالَّذِينَ فِي قُلُوبِهِم مَرَضٌ وَالْمُرْجِفُونَ فِي الْمَدِينَةِ لَنُغْرِيَنَّكَ بِهِمْ ثُمَّ لَا يُجَاوِرُونَكَ فِيهَا إِلَّا قَلِيلًا مَلْعُونِينَ أَيْنَمَا سُقِفُوا أُخِذُوا وَقُتِّلُوا تَقْتِيلًا. Even after this measure, if these hypocrites do not desist, and also those with a disease in their hearts, and those too who spread lies in Medina, we shall make you rise against them. Then they shall not be able to stay amongst you but with difficulty. Cursed shall they be wherever found. They shall be killed in an exemplary manner. So you can quite clearly see that these people were to be put to death if they persisted with the harassment. So there are other narratives also which Ustad Ghamidi says of similar nature that are often related and they are usually not credible enough in terms of historical authenticity of its isnad or the chain of narration. But even if they were to be assumed reliable enough, the nature of events described would still fall within the scope of the same context. After full manifestation of hostility in their blasphemy and sacrilege, these people were within the purview of the same law that the Quran has described as a divine custom pertaining to the denial of a messenger of God by his direct addressees. Some murders were also vindicated on these grounds. La yuqtalu Muslim bi kafir, which means that a Muslim cannot be punished or murdered or killed in lieu of a disbeliever. This too is a description of the same principle. Our scholars are aware of these aspects, yet they insist on deriving the law for punishment of blasphemy from these narratives. Also, Ustaz Ghamidi says that there is another incident which is often referred to by people. And in this incident, the Caliph Umar is reported to have struck off the head of a man who refused to accept Prophet Muhammad's legal verdict on a certain occasion. Our scholars relate this incident from the pulpits and directly encourage people to show the same attitude as reflected in the narrative towards those whom they perceive as blasphemers of the Prophet. However, the fact is that not just the first and second degree of hadith collections in terms of authenticity, but also the third degree works are devoid of this narrative. Even At-Tabri, who often relates narratives in all these three categories, has not regarded it worthy of consideration. This narrative comes from a gharib, which means an isolated chain of narrators, and mursal, which means there is an omission in the chain, and that has been cited by some exegetes in their commentaries. Those acquainted to some extent with hadith sciences have clarified that in the chain, its attribution to Abdullah ibn Abbas is absolutely implausible. Moreover, in the isnad of Ibn Mardawayh and Ibn Abi Hatim, the narrator Ibn al-Lahiya is za'if or weak. The view that exegetes relate this very narrative also has a Sha'n Nuzul or an occasion of revelation. So this verse of Surah Nisa is not in want of description of any reason of revelation, yet quite contrary to this, the narrative that Ustaz Imam Bukhari and other leading scholars of hadith have related as the occasion of revelation for this verse, and which narrative is often cited by exegetes, is one that pertains to a water dispute between the Prophet's paternal cousin Zubair and a person from the Ansar. When the matter was presented to the Prophet, he told Zubair to irrigate his field and leave the remaining water for the Ansar. The person from Ansar immediately retorted by saying, "O Prophet of God, is this because Zubair is your cousin?" You can clearly see that this highly impudent remark was clearly an imputation of injustice and nepotism. So it is related that the Prophet's face changed color, but he did not utter a single word save repeating his statement with more clarity, and decreed that the water be retained up to the edges of the field and the rest be left for the Ansar. So one must commend in the sense clergy on their choice in selection for ignoring this highly credible narrative reported by Imam Bukhari and Imam Muslim that reflects the Prophet's forbearance, forgiveness, compassion and kindness. Instead, they are enthusiastically and zealously relating everywhere a weak and improbable narrative related to how Umar struck off someone's neck, which is totally baseless. So now we come to the second of these issues, which is stoning to death. And it is alleged that the Prophet stoned to death people for various crimes. Now, Ustaz Ghamidi says that there are just two instances, if we sum up the whole life of the Prophet, in which the punishment of Rajam was given. And this punishment was given to two sorts of criminals. One were the prostitutes, and second, there were instances of rape. So only it was in the case of prostitution and rape was the punishment of Rajam given. And rape and prostitution, both are forms of fasad fil ard. So this in a nutshell is the answer of Ustaz Javed Ahmed Ghamidi, that the issue of stoning to death relates to fasad fil ard, and crimes for which this punishment was given was either prostitution or rape. And this he has shown from various narratives and various incidents that have been reported. So let us first take the issue of rape. And he says that the issue of rape is absolutely clear if we look at one of the narratives. In fact, there are two narratives. I'll cite one of them. The rest are just case reportings from which nothing becomes clear. But this particular narrative that he cites is, of course, something, according to him, which gives a very clear insight. Now, this incident, of course, has been reported in our hadith books. I'm just going to read out the text without the translation. It says, Alqama ibn Wa'il reports from his father that in the times of Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, a woman came out of her house to go and offer the prayer. Thus a person saw her on the way. He got hold of her and fulfilled his sexual desire from her. At this she shouted and cried out. So he took to his heels. Meanwhile a person chanced by. The woman told her how she had been molested by a person. When this conversation was taking place, a group of the Muhajirun too came over there. She narrated her tale to them as well. So they ran and caught hold of the person about which person the woman had indicated. Thus they brought him over to her, and she said, yes, this is the same person. They then took him to the Prophet. At this the Prophet immediately ordered for his punishment. Thereafter the real criminal stood up and said, O Messenger of God, it was me who molested this woman, not the other person. At this the Prophet told the woman, go, God has forgiven you, and expressed favorable words for the person who had been caught as a suspect. After that, regarding the person who had raped her, he said, stone him. So clearly you can see that it was rape because of which the Prophet had given the punishment of stoning to death. Stoning to death itself is a punishment form of taqtil, which is one of the punishments given to people who are guilty of spreading disorder, and muharba, which is fasad fil ard. So in the paradigm of Ustaz Ghamidi, this fits by simply accepting the fact or understanding the fact that this is no new crime for which this punishment was given. It was the crime of rape, which of course is something which is fasad fil ard. Next he says that the other incidents which has been reported in hadith narratives relates to prostitution, and prostitution of course itself is something which is a form of fasad fil ard, and prostitutes were punished for this crime. But he gives us certain details of this crime. He says that first of all, a temporary directive was given in Surah Nisa regarding the issue of prostitutes. So the words are, وَاللَّاتِي يَأْتِينَ الْفَاحِشَ مِن نِسَائِكُمْ فَاسْتَشْهِدُوا عَلَيْهِنَّ أَرْبَعَةً مِنْكُمْ فَإِنْ شَهِدُوا فَأَمْسِكُوهُنَّ فِي الْبُيُوتِ حَتَّى يَتَوَفَّاهُنَّ الْمَوْتُ أَوْ يَجْعَلَ اللَّهُ لَهُنَّ سَبِيلًا. And upon those of your women who commit fornication, call in as witnesses 4 people among yourselves to testify over them. If they testify, confine them to their homes until death overtakes them or God formulates another way for them. Ustaz says that the style and construction of the phrase وَاللَّاتِي يَأْتِينَ الْفَاحِشَ, those women who commit fornication, clearly indicates that prostitutes are being referred to. Since in this case the main offender is the woman, men are not even mentioned. The Prophet, while deciding the fate of such criminals, said that since they were not merely guilty of fornication, but were also guilty of spreading disorder in the society, as they had adopted profligacy or prostitution as a way of life, so those among them who deserved any mitigation or lenience should be administered the punishments of 100 lashes, according to the second verse of Surah Nur, because of committing fornication, and exiled in accordance with verse 33 of Surah Maida to protect the society from their dissolute practices. And those among them who did not deserve any leniency, they should be stoned to death according to the directive of Taqtil of the same verse, verse 33 of Surah Maida. Thus, the words of the prophets that have been reported also tells us this. خُذُوا عَنِّي خُذُوا عَنِّي خُذُوا عَنِّي قَدْ جَعَلَ اللَّهُ لَهُنَّ سَبِيلًا الْبِكْرُ بِالْبِكْرِ جَلْدُ مِئَةٍ وَالنَّفْيُ سَنَةٍ وَالثَّيِّبُ بِالثَّيِّبِ جَلْدُ مِئَةٍ وَالرَّجْمُ. Acquire it from me, acquire it from me, acquire it from me. The Almighty has revealed a way for these women in such crimes. We know that in that temporary directive it was said, God finds a way for them. So the Prophet has said that this is the way that God has found a way from them, and that is, in such crimes, unmarried men and women would be punished alike. And their punishment is 100 lashes and 1 year exile. Similarly, married men and women would be punished alike, and their punishment is 100 lashes and death by stoning. So, as I just said, that the reference Jalallahu lahunna sabila is to the women about whom the temporary directive had been given in the earlier verse of Surah Nisa. The Prophet's inquiry regarding the marital status of criminals guilty of fornication and profligacy was also based on the pretext of whether the criminal deserved any leniency. So what has happened is that our jurists have erroneously inferred from the Prophet's inquiry that the marital status of a woman was actually the basis of the punishment, and on this basis maintain that the directive of administering 100 lashes, which is of course the punishment of fornication mentioned in Surah Nur, was abrogated for married people who indulge in adultery. So actually Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, while deciding the fate of such criminals, asked many questions to see whether they deserved any lenience. The question of an offender's marital status was one such question, but our jurists concluded that it was the only question asked, and hence made it the basis of the punishment, and thereby they thought that the difference between the punishment of fornication and adultery is on the basis of being a person married or not. And as I said, Ustaz Ghamidi has explained this was not clearly understood by them, and they thereby incorporated in the Penal Code of Islam a totally baseless addition which is against the Quran as well as the norms of sense and reason. So, viewers, you can clearly see that in the case of Rajam also, it was meted out either to people who had raped, or they were rapists, or women who were prostitutes. And other than that, we do not find any such instance, and both these crimes of rape and prostitution, they amount to fasad fil ard, they amount to muharba, and hence the premise of Ustaz stands when he says that it was through muharba or because of muharba that the death punishment can be given. So basically it is this muharba that was perpetrated when people committed rape and prostitution. So this brings us to an end to this question also regarding capital punishment, and we have seen that how Ustaz Ghamidi's inference that this punishment only holds for people who murder someone or people who are guilty of fasad fil ard, it holds as far as all criticisms are concerned.